I think I can guess what you're thinking. Insects? Hasharat? Are we really going to be talking about insects at this time of the day? And what is it about the news recently? We've been hearing so much about a decline of insect populations all over the world. Is this something that we need to worry about here in the UAE? Is it something that maybe we should be thinking about? Well, before we talk about that in more detail, I'd like us to think a little bit about what it means when we say a species is new to science. Imagine you and me, are going for a walk, and we're going to Wadi Hatta or Wadi Shauka, and we're there to record all the different plants and reptiles and birds and mammals that we see. So we are studying the ecology. And imagine that together we find this beautiful plant, and we look at it and we have absolutely no clue what it is. Now, we at this point don't know whether it's just something that we haven't seen before or whether it's something that might be new in the world that hasn't been discovered yet. So what we might do is that we might take a photograph, and if we're trained to do so, we might take a sample, and we would take this to an expert somewhere in the world, maybe a museum. And if the expert comes back to us and says, "Congratulations, this species has never been seen before," then we would have been involved in discovering something new to science. The next thing that happens is that the plant would be described in detail, published in a scientific journal, and it will be given a name. But is this something that really happens? In fact, it happens all the time, because we still don't know a lot about biodiversity, different kinds of species, organisms around the world. And occasionally, this even makes headline news, like this little gibbon that was found. And it was so surprising to people and to science that we hadn't seen this species before, because it's a primate and quite a large species. And so, in fact, it made headline news in many different countries. But it isn't only the larger animals that make headline news. Occasionally, humble insects might even make it into the news. This little wasp was discovered in 2015 in England. So if one tiny little insect can make it into the news, would you be surprised if I tell you that somewhere out there in the world, there is a country where more than 400 species new to science have been discovered since 2008. I'm going to tell you more about that a little bit later. I'd like you to think about it, though. So what is it about biodiversity? Why do so many of us spend our time studying it and looking for species new to science, as well as all of the other species that already occur in an environment? Well, it all rather depends on whether you actually care for chocolate. Do you? What is the key ingredient for chocolate? It is actually a powder. And this powder comes from the seeds that grow within a fruit or a pod on the cocoa tree. And for the seed to be produced, the male part of a plant needs to fertilize the female part, and then you get the production of the seed. And very interestingly, plants or flowers can't do this on their own very easily. They require some help. And this service is often provided by insects. And for many years, scientists had no idea what it was that pollinated the cocoa flower. Why? Because it's a little different than other trees. When you think of trees and flowers, you can often imagine the top of the trees all full of flowers. Well, in fact, the cocoa flower doesn't grow on the branches. It grows on the tree trunk. And these little white flowers point downwards towards the ground. So in fact, a honeybee wouldn't do very well trying to fertilize this. So ultimately, and eventually after some study, it was found that it was a tiny little dubaba. a little fly that was responsible. We don't even like this fly very much because it's a midge, and at that it's a biting midge, so one that does also feed on blood. But just imagine that this one little fly is able to do all of this work. And if that is the case, we can imagine that where this tree originates in the Amazon basin, that there would be a rich biodiversity, and that there would be grasses and plants and many different kinds of animals, all maybe contributing these services, or as we call them, ecosystem services, to help maybe pollinate, maybe disperse seeds and so on. But what about in the UAE? Do we have diverse ecosystems? Do we have these complex environments that would sustain species? Well, let's find out. Not only do we have some absolutely spectacular and breathtaking scenery, but within all of these ecosystems, there is a myriad of species, all of which have been very much understudied. We still don't really understand many of the ecosystem services that they might be providing. And it's so interesting because with the story of yet another little Dubaba, when I first saw this, I don't know what I thought it was. What do you see when you first look at it? Are you drawn to the dark patterns on the wings? Well, I was. I didn't even see the body of this fly. I thought I was looking at ants until I realized that it was a fly that has developed tiny little images of ants on its wings. And it uses those to defend itself so that it can confuse a predator and quickly get away and not be eaten. So if we have such a rich biodiversity and many, many different species, can you now guess where that country is that has those more than 400-odd species that have been discovered new to science? It's here in the UAE. 400 plus species new to science. This means we know nothing about them. We just know that they occur. We've just recently been able to describe them, but we know nothing about what they need to survive, the kinds of habitat that we need to preserve so that they can continue, the kinds of ecosystems that they might be living in. And yet, our insects in the UAE are just as threatened as the insects all around the world. Why? Because just like around the world, we are losing habitats, or we're breaking them up into smaller pieces. Or we might be facing some pollution, including water pollution. And all of this has really dramatically impacted species biodiversity when it comes to insects. But at least it's a little bit of good news, right? Because we are studying the biodiversity and we know that there is a rich biodiversity. And all these insects that we have are providing food for many other organisms, such as this little reptile here. So don't you think it should be a little bit happier? Doesn't it look a little bit grumpy? I think it should smile. Thank you.